an investment. And this is kind of one way we like to talk about the type of decisions that can be made. So data, of course, they can be from a variety of sources. They can vary in quality, vary in completeness, vary in accuracy. I think we're all very used to seeing this, and we all know that, sometimes there's limitations in the data that we have access to and or the quality of it. So there's assumptions that need to be made. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later as we delve kind of into the analysis side of things. But really, the reason why we use data and analysis for decision making is because they provide us with an evidence-based approach to policymaking and planning. So really, as I said, we want to support kind of planning, policymaking, and investment decisions. Those are the buckets. You saw target setting in the other graphic. That can sometimes count as kind of a policymaking decision, sometimes not. If we utilize a data-driven decision-making process, we can incorporate changing variables and uncertainty. And the reason that we're talking about that today is because we're really talking about climate variables, climate variability, and climate change, and how do we incorporate that variability into the planning that we're going to be doing. And that's what we're going to dive into in some of these case studies that we're going to talk about. If we use data and data-driven analysis for our decision-making, it also supports transparency of why those decisions were made. It can help us explain where our targets came from, how the decisions were made. It improves accountability of that decision-making body. And of course, in the end, we've talked a lot about transparency and how it helps to simplify reporting. So the most important thing, and I probably don't need to tell this to this group of people, is how stakeholders are involved in the decision-making process and in the analysis process. So any planning process needs to be rooted in a very inclusive stakeholder process. And that stakeholder process and those stakeholders that are leading that process must have some kind of decision-making authority, right? What we're trying to avoid and what we talk a lot about is analysis for the sake of analysis, or a paper or a plan that sits on a shelf. So the most important part of this is not the data and it's not the analysis, but it's really how the stakeholders are involved and who's included in that stakeholder group. Stakeholders can include public sector entities, private sector entities, civil society, NGOs. Of course, the list goes on. I'm sure you all have very unique lists in your countries and in the sectors that you work in. But something that I've found in the work that I've done is how important stakeholders are as a source of data. And often when you're looking for some of this data so that you can do the analyses that you need to do for your decision-making process, they are one of the key parts of sources of where you're going to get that data from. There's a lot of ways to engage stakeholders. I think you all have experiences to share with the way that you have done this around your planning process, or perhaps around your NDCs, workshops or other events, or ways that you can build confidence and buy into the process, assumptions, results of the analyses that you're doing. And these stakeholders are really an important part of communicating the outputs and the outcomes of the analyses and helping translate those into kind of policy-making decisions and to do the outreach. So I want to give one example on the next slide of a recent stakeholder process. Oops, next slide after this. I will talk about this one first. So when I think of stakeholders, sometimes I'll ask maybe 3 questions about who to engage when I'm thinking through this. And one of the first is, who's going to benefit from this project or perhaps this planning process? Who might contribute to this? And then who may be impacted by this, right? And we have to include stakeholders up and down that entire stakeholder value chain. You could think of it that way. And so, we talk about the decision makers and we talk about the stakeholders. They're, often overlapping, but often when we talk about planning processes, decision makers are, perhaps ministry or agency officials, maybe they're regulators, maybe they're planners in the power sector, sometimes they're, the planners who are planning the transmission system, for example. Stakeholders might be private sector investors. They could be subnational governments or even municipalities in many cases that are going to be impacted or maybe contribute to the project. But sometimes those subnational governments might actually be the decision makers. So of course, this is not a definitive chart, just for thinking about things. Line ministries, how are they involved? Are they a decision maker, or perhaps they're just a stakeholder, depending on the process? Economic and social development authorities, NGOs, the general public. There are a lot of stakeholders to think through as we go into these climate risk planning processes, or our LTS planning process. So I think on the next slide is an example of a stakeholder engagement process that I was recently involved in the Philippines. And this is a process in which the government of the Philippines was trying to identify certain zones or areas of renewable energy to develop. And to do that, they required the input from a whole lot of different stakeholder groups. And I just want to walk through how we structured this process. And when I say this process, I mean a 2-year-long process. I think many of you know that planning, NDC development, LTS development, none of this is quick. None of this happens in a month. And so this takes a long, sustained effort of engaging stakeholders over this period of time, from inception all the way to the end, to communicating and translating those results. So I just want to show, so if you start at the top, the lead entity here, and it doesn't state this, but the lead entity kind of overseeing the planning activity was the Philippines Department of Energy. So essentially their Ministry of Energy. So they were authoritated to lead this and be the lead decision maker. But to do that, they needed to assemble what they called, and that's the next tier down, a technical advisory committee. And that technical advisory committee guided and reviewed the actual work and the inputs and helped to set objectives along the way. That technical advisory committee consisted of other ministries that were involved. It consisted of the regulator, the transmission system operator, the utilities, etc. And then from there were 2 working groups. And those working groups were the working groups that actually did the modeling. And so they did the actual analysis. And so what they did is they used those assumptions and the objectives that were determined in the technical advisory committee, fed those into the modeling work they did. That was reviewed at certain intervals by that technical advisory committee to help guide that work along the way. And in the end, after about 2 years of work, what happened is they were able to develop an actual transmission plan that accessed the best wind and solar resources with the authority of the regulator and with the interest of the private sector. So a lot of stakeholders involved. I think this is a really interesting example, something that if you want more detail on how this worked, I'd be happy to share more many 100-page documents with you if that's something that you want. So stakeholders, very important. We'll be interested to hear from you kind of how you've engaged stakeholders in your country, in your NDCs, and in your LTS process. But we're really here to talk about the meat of this and the most exciting part, which is the analysis. And so I'm going to pass this over to Sam to talk a little bit more in depth about that.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Yeah, so as Jen mentioned, we're going to start to tease out some of these sort of data-driven decision-making processes. So I'm going to transition into talking to us about that in a little bit more detail, parse out a few specific steps and key components. Okay, so there's a lot going on this flowchart in front of you, but this is sort of our mind map outlining our stepwise process for data-driven decision-making. And I'll note this is available for you on the Google Drive in the session 3 presentation if you want to refer back to it later. So, data-driven decision-making, as Jen mentioned, this is a process that you're all familiar with. These are considerations and steps that you're all likely undertaking in some form in your various jobs and in your countries. We're going to walk through some of these steps and think through some key questions to be asking at each of these intervals. And I'm also going to pull out and focus on a few key areas. And if you have any questions as we're going along, feel free to drop them in the chat. So there are 6 key steps outlined here going from left to right. So there's preliminary planning, data identification and collection, model selection, scenario development, interpreting results, and then monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And just a little bit more on how to read this. So the numbers and the diamonds correspond with the text directly opposite it. So for example, number 1 up on the left hand here with that green diamond corresponds directly with the text below it, preliminary planning. And then number 2, that sort of white pie chart icon in the bottom left corresponds to the text directly above it, and it sort of alternates in that fashion from left to right. So for now, I'm just going to highlight these first two steps while we're on this slide. So, preliminary planning, this is that sort of inception period, right? You're getting the ball rolling, you're thinking through what it is you want to achieve, what decisions you're trying to make, in this case, the development of long-term strategy. So this is asking questions like, what question do I want to answer? For example, what are my emission reduction goals to the mid-century? Or, what decision are you trying to make? How much should I be investing in renewables or new infrastructure? Or perhaps what is the optimal energy mix to achieve those greenhouse gas emission reduction targets? And, Jen talked a lot about the importance of stakeholder engagement, and that certainly comes into play here as well. As you're starting to plan, you're thinking through who has decision-making authority, who are those key stakeholders, how are you going to identify, engage, and convene them? I know we've talked about some existing stakeholder mechanisms in your countries already. And related to this, while you're identifying those people involved, you're also likely determining your key priorities. So, what's the most important thing for you to determine and understand throughout this process? What's your focus? Is it emissions reductions? Is it climate resilience? And so on. So then, moving into step 2 here, once you've started to outline what it is you want to achieve or the question you want to answer, you're likely going to start thinking through the information you actually need to answer those questions. So this is, data identification and collection, which involves literally, what data do I need to answer my question and make these decisions? Where can I find, access, and gather that necessary data? What is the availability and quality of that data? Are there any relevant data gaps? And there are a lot of different types of data and possible sources of data, and we're going to touch upon that a little bit more on the next slide. Logan, you can go ahead and flip. Great. Okay, so, we all know there's a lot of different types of data and places from which to find and use that data, depending on the goals you've set out, the intentions of, in this case, your long-term strategy, maybe the priorities you've set, your data needs are going to change. So I've highlighted a few types of data here. Climate data, so this is temperature forecasts, rainfall data, sea level rise, etc. These are all data points you're all probably fairly familiar with. And then we also have sector data. So, for example, if we're thinking about the energy sector, a data point there could be like average energy use, that sort of thing. Another data point or source rather that could be relevant is socioeconomic data. So perhaps some population statistics or GDP data points. I've also pointed to a couple of resources here. These, again, will be available on the Google Drive. So the Columbia Climate Data Library, the Caribbean Weather Impacts Group, the Climate Watch, and then also the Caribbean Climate Online Risk and Adaptation Tool. And obviously, if there are other data sources or places where you found data, feel free to drop those in the chat or throw them in for us to discuss. I think another thing to note here that's really important, and Jen touched upon this briefly as well, is that stakeholders may provide a key source of data. A lot of the data that you may use may actually come through those stakeholder processes. And I think, such as in that previous Philippines example that Jen touched upon, those technical advisory committees and working groups were a major source of data that they ended up using in some of those processes. However, in contrast, sometimes you just don't have the data, right? So this is when we're starting to utilize, generate or make our own data rather, right? So I think we're also going to talk about models a bit in a second, but I just want to flag the data you need may vary depending on the requirements of a model or tool you're using. And lastly, this is obviously apparent to anyone who's any and all of us who are working with data, that it's going to be context dependent. So what data is available, who has access to it, is there capacity to collect any additional data that may be needed? So these are all key considerations and questions to be thinking about throughout the planning process. And now we're going to dig a little bit further into models. So that's step 3 on the flow chart, which is model selection. So what modeling tools are available? Which model helps answer my question? What are the licensing fees and requirements? Is there capacity to use the tool? What data points or inputs are required for this model? And models are really just a tool we use for analysis. And I think it's important to know that while they're incredibly useful, models aren't necessarily always going to be needed for analysis, right? There are analyses that are just going to be, spreadsheets on our computers. However, as our analyses get more complex, when there's more variables at play, we're thinking through our long-term strategy, which is going to have a higher degree of complexity. Models are particularly useful tools to help us conduct those analyses. So as I noted, Data needs are in part dependent upon the model of choice. So that step 2 of data identification we just discussed in this step 3 of model selection really go hand in glove. Lack of certain data may limit your ability to use a certain model that has specific data requirements, and related maybe specific data inputs for your model may actually guide additional data collection processes. All right, so we're going to talk in brief about 2 sort of like buckets or categories of model types, which is economy-wide models and sector-specific models. Logan, you can go ahead and flip to the next slide. So this is by no means comprehensive or all encompassing of the types of models that are out there, but this is sort of a nice overview of these 2 sort of types of models. And this table just outlines some key attributes and considerations to think through when determining the type of model you may want to use. And as I said, this is not comprehensive. If there are other models or types of models you've been using, again, feel free to drop them in the chat. So economy-wide models at a high level, these are tools like the 2050 Pathways Calculator or the Global Change Assessment Model. These are going to offer high-level representations or general visions, excuse me, at the economy or country level. These tend to be more broadly available. However, they do lack some of those finer details or nuance since they are offering this sort of snapshot high-level picture. However, this might be a really useful tool for countries that are just starting to think about their long-term strategies or those emissions projections out to 2050. Alternatively, sector-specific models, we'll be hearing more about these as we get into our case studies as well and how they work. They're going to be more granular, provide a very detailed picture into a sector of choice. And because they have a very detailed picture, they require detailed data inputs, and they're going to also churn out much more detailed outputs. So these are going to have really nuanced results that may provide direct, specific, actionable targets and/or directions, which is great, particularly if you're seeking to make a decision or determination about a priority sector. But some limitations or drawbacks here is that they also may require significant sector expertise. And as I noted, they're going to require pretty detailed sector-specific information as their data inputs. And of course, these will be less effective if those data points are unavailable, inaccessible, or largely incomplete. So this is really just to get us thinking about how these models and tools, what some of their benefits and limitations may be. We'll be providing some additional resources on additional models for you as well on the Google Drive. And again, based on any ongoing work in your country or your sector, if there are any really relevant models you've been using, feel free to drop them in chat and we can discuss them as a group. So now we're going to move into step 4 on that flowchart, which is scenario development. And this is, developing appropriate future scenarios. And this is really essential to utilizing models effectively. It's a crucial step. And this is also where we can start to integrate our climate risk considerations that we talked about last week. So as I said, this is a key component. And again, this is really where we can start to actively integrate those climate considerations into our decision-making process. So let's dig in. At this stage of the process, we're thinking about, what are these possible future scenarios that I need to examine to help understand and answer the key question I've identified in my preliminary planning. How is it going to help me make my decisions and determinations? So in the case of a long-term strategy, what scenarios do you need to help you set those emission reduction targets all the way out to 2050? So essentially, in essence here, what you're doing is you're developing a set of scenarios to test in your model. So, these scenarios help anticipate change and prepare a response. So this is where we're capturing uncertainties, that variability. So developing these possible futures helps to plan for possible changes and then respond to them in kind. So this, I think we can all understand this is really important for thinking about possible, changes related to climate change over time, because incorporating those into scenarios can help us think through what those changes might look like and how we could respond in turn. So stakeholders are really essential here as well in determining scenarios. So at its core, scenarios are what primarily dictate the outcomes of the model. And because the outcomes then dictate decision-making, scenarios are really crucial, right? So whatever scenarios you decide to input into your model is going to generate specific results. And those results are what you're utilizing to make your decisions. So the scenarios are a really crucial piece here. So you're going to develop a couple different scenarios. These get analyzed and compared to one another. And again, those comparisons are going to help stakeholders make these choices or make decisions. Which scenario had the best outcomes, was the most achievable, reach those greenhouse gas emission reduction targets on the timeline you want, right? So these scenarios, as I've noted, capture these uncertainties, these variabilities. They can also include possible targets or assumptions. So for example, your scenario could capture uncertainties like different sea level changes or frequency of hurricanes. And in the case of a long-term strategy, differing possible targets related to your greenhouse gas emission targets. And they can also include different assumptions. So maybe you're assuming constant or differing technology costs over time. And again, just another plug here for some transparency. Any assumptions you make, perhaps that example I just made about technology costs, should be documented clearly and agreed upon by stakeholders, which of course is going to support the transparency of your long-term strategy. So this is sort of scenario development at a baseline. And again, we're going to hear a little bit more about this in our case studies later on. But I want to talk a little bit more about how at this stage of the process we can really integrate our climate considerations. So Logan, if you want to flip to the next slide. Great, thank you. So we talked about how scenarios really integrate these uncertainties. So climate considerations are really integrated into our models via our scenarios as uncertainties. We can develop multiple possible future scenarios that incorporates these at differing levels. And including them in the model ensures that our outputs are also incorporating our climate considerations, right? So as I noted, our scenarios are the key driver of what's actually going to come out of the model. So if we're ensuring that our climate considerations are input into our scenarios, that ensures we're going to see them again in our results and they'll help inform our decision making. So again, this is just another plug to be documenting your data, your assumptions and methodologies, because that does support transparency. So I just briefly want to connect this back to some of what we discussed last week about climate risk. We walked through some examples of identifying threats and vulnerabilities, thinking about risk assessment and planning for resilience. So, perhaps the product of a risk assessment is you've identified a key area or risk you really want to address throughout your decision-making process. And so let's say that now you've identified more severe hurricanes as a threat, and there's possible impact related to that of flooding, and you have a vulnerability of a lot of agricultural land in like low-lying flood-prone areas, and then there's maybe some secondary losses of crop loss. So perhaps that's a risk you've identified that you really want to address in your decision making, and you're utilizing a model to do so. So by incorporating those considerations as uncertainties into your model, you're ensuring that your results also have those same considerations included. So maybe in your scenarios, you're inputting varying levels of investment in land management or flood diversion, or perhaps different frequencies of severe hurricanes, right? So these uncertainties in scenarios are a key component to ensuring that our outputs and in turn our decisions integrate climate risk into our long-term planning. Okay, so we've talked a lot about these scenarios in our models, but once you run these models, as I've said, you have these results that you then have to interpret. So we're going to move quickly into the last couple of steps here of our process. Logan, you can go ahead and flip. Great. So this step 5 is really interpreting your results. So this is where you're reviewing, interpreting, and communicating your results. So you're thinking through things like, how do I actually interpret, utilize, and effectively communicate the results that I've seen? Are my data sources, assumptions, and processes documented and reported? Again, key for transparency. And what decisions and determinations can you actually make based upon those results? So after you've made your decisions, perhaps you've started implementing those decisions or policies, this next step is monitoring, evaluation, and learning, right? So this is thinking through, how do you monitor your progress? How do you apply your lessons learned towards future planning processes? How do you ensure internal capacity to revise and iterate? And this is an essential component because, as we've said, these are iterative processes that can be revisited over time. And in the case of a long-term strategy, last week we talked about how as resources and priorities change and shift over time, your long-term strategy may be revisited to become more ambitious or comprehensive. So having some of these monitoring evaluation strategies in place can help facilitate revisiting these things. All right, so remember, there's a lot here, but this graphic is available as a resource on the Google Drive and is included in your exercise slide deck as well. So now that we've talked sort of at a high level, teasing out what this process looks like, we're going to transition into talking about some case studies. And I'm going to have Jen give you a little bit of an introduction to what our 2 case studies are and who our speakers will be, and then we'll break out into groups.
Great, thanks, Sam. So I know that that was a lot of excellent info that Sam went through, and what we're hoping to do now is solidify that information through 2 different case studies that are going to talk about how climate risk and resilience were considered in a specific sectoral planning exercise. So we have 2 case studies. A is focused on energy in the power sector. We're going to talk about integrated resource and resilience planning. And B is a case study, and I think if Logan flips to the next slide, we're going to talk about AFLU. So a case study looking at agriculture and how climate risk and resilience was included in planning in that sector. So what we're going to do is drop 2 links into the chat box, one for case study A and the second for case study B. And if you join the first, if you make sure that you're muted, please, in this main breakout, then what we're going to do is join those breakout rooms and we will go from there. I know we are quickly running out of time for these really exciting discussions and exercises, so we'll definitely note next time to have some more time for those. You guys have access to these slides and you have access to your slide decks. So of course, please feel free to continue to work on those and think through some of those questions. And of course, ask more questions in the chat box, things that we're going to get to, I promise, in our last session. I think we'll have a lot more time for discussions. We don't have a lot of time for discussion right now, so I think that what we're going to do is wrap up, and then we can keep this channel open for a little bit if folks want to continue talking with each other. The organizers are going to have to head out. But just a few things to take away from today is today really focused on data-driven decision-making and how data can help us to do the analysis that underpins decision-making. This data-driven decision-making can support planning. A lot of us are here because we're talking about planning. That's our LTS planning. It can support policy making. It can also support investment decisions. Through this process of data-driven decision-making, we can incorporate changing uncertainties, in other words, climate change. There's a lot of other uncertainties and scenarios that we want to look at, but of course we're here really to talk about how we're incorporating climate change into these decision-making processes. We talked a little bit about stakeholder engagement. I think everyone has some personal experience with how they are currently engaging stakeholders in their planning processes and how these planning processes must be rooted in some kind of decision-making authority to make this LTS planning stick. And climate risk is something that we need to consider and build in during scenario development, also along with those key stakeholders and decision makers. So that we can help inform those results and make sure that those results in our LTSs, of course, are resilient to some of those climate risks. So we are going to reconvene on our next session, and I think, a few resources for folks. I did want to, there's so many resources in this, and I would love to also get resources from folks here who are attending, who I think have a lot of information to share. I showed that target looking data-driven decision and analysis chart, and that comes from a data-driven decision-making guide for the energy sector. I may have written it, so I'm very partial to it. Also, we pulled together an LTS analysis report that actually kind of looks at some of the transparency and long-term strategies progress in many of the countries that are represented here. That report is public and published. There's a link here. More info on IRRP, on CGAR, who spoke in the AFLU session, as well as a scoping analysis. I think that's on there twice. Report for resources. So moving on to next week. So we're going to hopefully synthesize a lot of what we've been talking about here and in the past two other sessions, to move on and really synthesize all of this into identifying what are some needs and what are some gaps moving forward as we're all thinking through our LTS planning. And we certainly hope that you'll be able to join us. We're going to have some panelists, we're going to have some good discussion, we're going to have a lot of resources, and hopefully find some ways that we can all work together and come up with some good solutions and identify some potential opportunities for some additional training needs or resource needs. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, keep popping them into the chat box as they come up. We'll leave this channel open for a little bit for you to keep conversing, and see everybody on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Everybody, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Good.
Jen, are you still there? No.
I'm still here. I'm going to pop out in a second. We're just leaving this open.
Yeah. I just wanted to find out if the links would be shared separately.
Yes, they're embedded in the slide decks that are in the Google Drive. So all of this material is in the Google Drive. I'm also happy to share anything with you in email as well.
Okay, is it an active link that you could just click on, or is it that you have to copy and paste?
It should be in the PDFs. They should be active links, and if not, I'll have to figure out how to fix that.
I haven't tried. I just I thought that crossed my mind in terms of ease of access. Okay, thank you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, bye.
Goodbye. Thanks, everybody.